I know.
Whoa, that's so cool.
Yes, totally. I hiked around there a lot. Like, yeah, and I know exactly what you're talking about then in terms of the ag. Yeah.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. So your brother, or why are you there? Is it
Well,
like,
he got an internship, and initially I was just supposed to like drive him around and just be his little chauffeur. But um,
huh?
then we ended up not driving here, and they gave us a ride. So I'm still here. I'm just tagging along. So I get to just be watching, and it's like I'm doing a ride along. But it's cool.
That's super fun.
Yeah.
Oh, Etna. That's the funniest little town in the middle of nowhere.
I'm in a motel in Etna right now.
Oh my God. That is so funny to
I'm
me.
in the motel in Etna.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was gonna say. I didn't even know they had a motel. It's such a small town. It's tiny.
Yep.
Yep. There used to be a lot of beavers in that valley, and of course they took those out and
Yeah, that's exactly what I heard from the people.
mhm, changed the ecology drastically.
And there was gold in the Scott River, so they had these big dredgers come through, and they would just scoop out the whole riverbed and pile it into this machine, which would sort out the gold and sort like the topsoil and the river stones into separate things. But it dumped it back out, like the whatever wasn't gold that they dumped back out. They dumped it, so they put the topsoil out first, and then they dumped all the cobble and the rock on top of it, so they just buried all that stuff, and now it's just like barren piles of rock everywhere that the soil is completely gone.
Ah, so frustrating. Nice, James. Back, yes. Decentralized consciousness.
Can you guess which ones are neurons and which ones are fungi?
Yes.
Oh, I mean, I can, but barely.
The neurons are the blue ones.
Yes.
Jen is like, I know the answer.
I guess wrong. I thought the neurons were the green ones.
Now you can see the nuclei kind of
Yeah.
in the
I now I see it.
Yeah, I can too. Well, I think we're ready to go. James, you saw the flow email, right? Just want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay.
Basically, what we said, James, is just after the
After
guiding questions are restated. Maybe you can. It's great to have someone kind of start us off because sometimes.
Yeah, I will I'll pretend like I didn't even prepare for this. I'll just be
Okay. Yeah,
like,
that'll make you look even cooler.
I'll just be like, I gotta like,
Sweet,
I've
sweet.
got a very strong opinion.
That's awesome. I like that idea.
I have a very strong opinion.
I like it.
Oh, okay, sounds great.
Yeah, you know what? I do have something to say about this.
Perfect.
I do.
All right, are we ready to let some of the folks in?
We are, but I don't see Lauren. I believe she's joining. No? Did anybody hear otherwise?
I haven't heard otherwise.
Cindy,
I'm
maybe
sure she'll come in a few minutes. She'll come in a little late.
I was gonna say maybe we should just broadcast a message that we'll let people in a minute. Just give her a second, just in case she has any notes.
Wait, so Kelly, you grew up in Wairika? That's really cool.
Actually, I grew up in Weed, California,
I've been there. I've been there.
and it's a big joke. Everyone's like, "I want a T-shirt."
That's what I was thinking when I went through this.
Yeah. Stop by the sign and be like, "Oh my god."
I have that picture now. From like 3 years ago or something.
Yeah, don't you have that picture? Yeah, nice, dude. Yeah, beautiful area. It's changing like everywhere, like more fire prone and drier since when I was little, even, but still wild and lots of cool places to explore where there's very few people, which I like to do as a nerdy biologist kid. But kind of, full of Republicans too. so I had to get out of there. Just I couldn't find.
Today, driving around, I saw like, so many. I saw bears. I saw mountain quail. I saw Trump 2020 signs. I saw agriculture. I saw
Biden kind
yeah.
of signs.
The,
Yeah.
there's a fire. Like everything is all smoky and just.
Oh, is it?
We got the whole package.
Yeah, my parents own 86 acres outside of Wairika, up Greenhorn Road in the kind of woods up there. So I still go there quite often.
All right, should we let people in? Or are we gonna continue to wait?
I think it's usually fine to start. Usually Lauren just drops in if she's running late.
Jen is on the fence. Jen is contemplating.
Yeah, but also the show must go on.
The show must go on.
I feel like I've seen it before where we just start and then Lauren joins halfway through.
Okay,
I'm
you're
new.
muted, Jen, so I can't tell.
Sorry.
We're good? All right, we're opening it up. Here we go.
Sounds good.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 5th week of Learning and Mending. The Metabolic Studios Learning and Mending series is now in its 5th iteration. In this series, from micro to macro, we will be exploring the implications of an integrated forms of systems thinking that allows us to think across all scales, from particle, cell, brain, society, ecosystem to cosmic matter. From micro to macro, we'll build upon what we learned about from Anna Singh's disturbance ecology and have an emphasis on complexity, networks, and patterns of organization. Many of you have received embroidery kits from us of native plants, birds, and microscopic organisms that Metabolic Studio is currently cultivating on its project sites. Taken as a collection, all of the embroideries will collectively illustrate biogeoconosis, which describes the intimate association between living things and the physical environment. If you've not received an embroidery kit, or you would like another one, please send your name and mailing address to info@metabolicstudio.org. Tonight, we will share our screen, and we encourage you to read a section of the text aloud with us. When there is a pause in the reading, please feel free to unmute yourself and begin reading where the last person left off. Silence is golden, and there is no pressure to fill the transitional spaces while we enjoy a breath and continue crafting. Feel free to jump in and continue reading at your comfort level. You don't have to read, it's also fine to enjoy listening. And I will now pass it over to Kelly.
Hi, everybody. Consciousness this week. We're going deep. We're going to look at consciousness in our readings, in both readings, different forms. We're continuing on with the systems view of life from Fritjof Capra. And in the first reading, we really look at the challenge of scientifically studying consciousness, especially through a Cartesian lens, because really it's more of an emergent property. So it can't be described just by, biochemistry alone. And so they're having to really get transdisciplinary and think outside of normal paradigms in order to be able to describe consciousness with any sort of accuracy. So the first reading kind of dives into that and looks at this triple braid concept and things like that. And then our second reading goes into language as a form, an emergent property of consciousness and abstract thought. And it's really interesting because they talk about how embodied consciousness is and how even language is thought to have originated from physical gestures and how we use physical metaphors to understand the world. So I thought it was a really nice reading in that way. And yeah, so our guiding questions, I'll put them in the chat now and at the end, but the first one relates to the language reading, and it says, how do you think metaphors shape our understanding and actions in the world? And how can we flip destructive or exploitative metaphors. And the second one I have here is, how can we think about consciousness studies beyond the human protagonist? What other forms of decentralized consciousness might exist? And how might we more deeply empathize or relate with the consciousness of other animals or forests, etc. So I will put these in the chat just for seeds of thought while we read, and we'll come back around to them. And now we're gonna do time lapse. Oh no, embroidery of the week.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Tonight, I want to share with you a beautiful embroidery we received this week from Alex, and it is of mallow. And what I wanted you to pay attention to, sorry, my fan's blowing it, is the way that he did the patterns of the leaves. I thought it had a lot of texture and depth to it. And the time lapse that we will show tonight is also another technique that kind of reminded me of this when I saw this. So I will share that with you right now. And let's see, let's make sure everybody can see it. And I will play. And now we can begin with tonight's reading.
Okay, 2 types of consciousness. Although cognitive scientists have proposed many different approaches to the study of consciousness and have sometimes engaged in heated debates, it seems that there is a growing consensus on 2 important points. The first, as mentioned above, is the recognition that consciousness is a cognitive process emerging from complex neural activity. The second point is that the distinction between 2 types of consciousness, in other words, 2 types of cognitive experiences, which emerge at different levels of neural complexity. The first type, known as primary consciousness or core consciousness, arises when cognitive processes are accompanied by basic perceptual, sensory, and emotional experience. Core consciousness, writes neurologist Antonio Damasio, 1999, provides the organism with a sense of self about one moment, now, and about one place, here. The scope of core consciousness is the here and now. The biologist Gerald Edelman believes that this transient sense of self is probably experienced by most mammals and perhaps by some birds and other vertebrates. The second type of consciousness, variously called higher order consciousness, extended consciousness, or reflective consciousness, involves more elaborate self-awareness, the concept of self, held by a thinking and reflecting subject. This extended experience of self-awareness, identity, and personhood is based on memories of the past and anticipation of the future. It emerged during the evolution of the great apes or hominids, together with language, conceptual thought, and all the characteristics that fully unfolded in human consciousness. Because of the critical role of reflection in this extended conscious experience, we shall call it reflective consciousness. Reflective consciousness involves a level of cognitive abstraction that includes the ability to hold mental images, allowing us to formulate values, beliefs, goals, and strategies. This evolutionary stage established a fundamental link between consciousness and social phenomenon, because with the evolution of language arose not only the inner world of concepts and ideas, but also the social world of organized relationships and culture. We shall return to this important evolutionary link when we discuss the social dimension of life.
The nature of conscious experience. I'm in the right place, right? Okay. The central challenge of a science of consciousness is to explain the experiences associated with cognitive events. Different states of conscious experience are sometimes called qualia by cognitive scientists because each state is characterized by a special qualitative feel. The challenge of explaining these qualia is the hard problem identified by Chalmers. After reviewing the conventional attempts of cognitive science, Chalmers asserts that none of them can explain why certain neural processes give rise to experience. To account for conscious experience, he concludes, we need an extra ingredient in the explanation. This statement is reminiscent of the debate between mechanists and vitalists about the nature of biological phenomena during the early decades of the 20th century. Whereas the mechanists asserted that all biological phenomena can be explained in terms of the laws of physics and chemistry, the vitalists maintained that a vital force must be added to those laws as an additional non-physical, quote, ingredient to explain biological phenomena. The insight that emerged from this debate, though not formulated until many decades later, is that in order to explain biological phenomena, we need to take into account not only the conventional laws of physics and chemistry, but also the complex nonlinear dynamics of living networks. A full understanding of biological phenomena is reached only when we approach it through the interplay of three different levels of description: the biology of the observed phenomena, the laws of physics and biochemistry, and the nonlinear dynamics of complex systems. It seems to us that cognitive scientists find themselves in a very similar situation, albeit a different level of complexity, when they approach the study of consciousness. Conscious experience is an emergent phenomenon, meaning that it cannot be explained in terms of neural mechanisms alone. Experience emerges from the complex nonlinear dynamics of neural networks and can be explained only if our understanding of neurobiology is combined with our understanding of those dynamics. To reach a full understanding of consciousness, we must approach it through the careful analysis of conscious experience, of the physics, biochemistry, and biology of the nervous system, and of the nonlinear dynamics of neural networks. A true science of consciousness will be formulated only when we understand how these three levels of description can be woven together in what Francisco Varela has called the triple braid of consciousness research. When the study of consciousness is approached by braiding together experience, neurobiology, and nonlinear dynamics, the hard problem turns into the challenge of understanding and accepting two new scientific paradigms. The first is the paradigm of complexity theory. Since most scientists are used to working with linear models, they're often reluctant to adopt the nonlinear framework of complexity theory and find it difficult to fully appreciate the implications of nonlinear dynamics. This applies in particular to the phenomenon of emergence. It seems quite mysterious that the experience should emerge from neurophysiological processes. However, this is typical of emergent phenomenon, as we discussed in section 8.2. Emergence results in the creation of novelty, and this novelty is often qualitatively different from the phenomena out of which it emerged. In addition to complexity theory, scientists will need to accept another new paradigm, the recognition that the analysis of lived experience, that is, of subjective phenomena, has to be an integral part of any science of consciousness. And Valera and Scheer have argued that this amounts to a profound change of methodology, which many cognitive scientists are reluctant to embrace, and which lies at the very root of the hard problem of consciousness. The great reluctance of science to deal with subjective phenomena is part of our Cartesian heritage. Descartes' fundamental division between mind and matter, between the I and the world, made us believe that the world could be described objectively, that is, without ever mentioning the human observer. Such an objective description of nature became the ideal of all science. However, 3 centuries after Descartes, quantum theory showed us that this classical ideal of an objective science, which cannot be maintained when dealing with, this classical ideal of an objective science cannot be maintained when dealing with atomic phenomena. And more recently, the Santiago theory of cognition has made it clear that cognition itself is not a representation of an independently existing world, but rather a bringing forth of a world through the process of living.
I can read for a little bit. It's Laura. Are we on? We have come to realize. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, that's where we left off.
We've come to realize that the subjective dimension is always implicit in the practice of science. However, in general, it is not the explicit focus. It is a science of consciousness. By contrast, some of the very data to be examined in subjective inner experiences. To collect and analyze these data systematically requires a disciplined examination of first-person subjective experiences. Only when such an examination becomes an integral part of the study of consciousness will it deserve to be called a science of consciousness. As we argued in section 4.3, this does not mean that we have to give up scientific rigor. Even when the object of investigation consists of first-person accounts of conscious experience, the inner subjective validation that is standard practice in science need not be abandoned. Pass.
Schools of consciousness study. The use of complexity theory and the systematic analysis of first-person conscious experience will be crucial in formulating a proper science of consciousness. In the last decade, several significant steps have already been taken toward this goal. Indeed, the extent to which nonlinear dynamics and the analysis of first-person experience are utilized can be used to identify several broad schools of thought among the great variety of current approaches to the study of consciousness. The first is the most traditional school of thought. It includes, among others, the neuroscientist Patricia Churchland and the molecular biologist Francis Crick. This school has been called neuroreductionist by Francisco Varela because it reduces consciousness to neural mechanisms. Thus, consciousness is, quote, explained away, as Churchland puts it. Much like heat in physics was explained away once, it was recognized as the energy of molecules in motion. In the words of Francis Crick, you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. This statement certainly sounds like the classic reductionist position, conscious experience reduced to the firing of neurons. And in his book, Crick describes the corresponding neurophysiology in considerable technical detail. However, in other parts of the book, somewhat inconsistently, he asserts that conscious experiences are emergent properties that, quote, arise in the brain from the interactions of its many parts. He never addresses the nonlinear dynamics of these processes of emergence, and hence we do not consider his theory as truly systemic. However, we feel that Varela's categorical identification of Crick as a reductionist may be too harsh.
The second school of consciousness study, known as functionalism, is the most popular among today's cognitive scientists and philosophers. Its proponents assert that mental states are defined by their functional organization, that is, by patterns of causal relations in the nervous system. The functionalists are not Cartesian reductionists because they pay careful attention to nonlinear neural patterns. However, they deny that conscious experience is an irreducible emergent phenomenon. It may seem an irreducible experience, but in their view, a conscious state is defined completely by its functional organization and is therefore understood once that pattern of organization has been identified. Thus, Daniel Dennett, 1991, one of the leading functionalists, gave his book the catchy title, Consciousness Explained. Many patterns of functional organization have been postulated by cognitive scientists, and consequently, there are many different strands of functionalism today. Finally, there is a small but growing school of consciousness studies that embraces both the use of complexity theory and the analysis of first-person experience. Francisco Varela, in 1996, who was one of the pioneers of this school of thought, gave it the name neurophenomenology. Neurophenomenology. Phenomenology is an important branch of modern philosophy, founded by Edmund Husserl at the beginning of the 20th century and developed further by many European philosophers, including Martin Heidegger and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. The central concern of phenomenology is the disciplined examination of experience, and the hope of Husserl and his followers was and is that a true science of experience would eventually be established in partnership with the natural sciences. Neurophenomenology is an approach to the study of consciousness that combines the disciplined examination of conscious experience with the analysis of Neurophenomenology is an approach to the study of consciousness that combines the disciplined examination of conscious experience with the analysis of corresponding neural patterns and processes. With this dual approach, neurophenomenologists explore various domains of experience and try to understand how they emerge from complex neural activities. In doing so, these cognitive scientists are indeed taking the first steps towards formulating a true science of experience.
The view from within. The basic premise of neurophenomenology is that brain physiology and conscious experience should be treated as two interdependent domains of research with equal status. The disciplined examination of experience and the analysis of the corresponding neural patterns and processes will generate reciprocal constraints so that research activities in the two domains can guide one another in a systematic exploration of consciousness. Today's neurophenomenologists are a very diverse group. They differ in the manner in which first-person experience is taken into account, and they have also proposed different models for the corresponding neural processes. At its inception, the whole field was presented in some detail in a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies, volume, all that stuff, titled The View from Within, and edited by Francisco Varela and the philosopher Jonathan Shear. As far as first-person experience is concerned, three main approaches are being pursued. The adherents of all three insist that they are not talking about a casual inspection of experience, but about using strict methodologies that require special skills and sustained training, just like the methodologies in other areas of scientific observation. The first approach is introspection, a method developed at the very beginning of scientific psychology. The second is the phenomenological approach in the strict sense, as developed by Husserl and his followers. The third approach consists of using the wealth of evidence gathered from meditative practice in various spiritual traditions. Throughout human history, the disciplined examination of experience has been used within widely differing philosophical and religious traditions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Sufism, and Christianity. We may therefore expect that some of the insights of these traditions will be valid beyond their particular metaphysical and cultural frameworks. This applies especially to Buddhism, which has flourished in many different cultures, originating with the Buddha in India, then spreading to China and Southeast Asia, reaching Japan, and many centuries later, crossing the Pacific to California. In these different cultural contexts, mind and consciousness have always been the primary objects of Buddhist contemplative investigations. Buddhists regard the undisciplined mind as an unreliable instrument for observing different states of consciousness, and following the Buddha's initial instructions, they have developed a great variety of techniques for stabilizing and refining the attention. Over the centuries, Buddhist scholars have formulated elaborate and sophisticated theories about many subtle aspects of conscious experience, which are likely to be fertile sources of inspiration for cognitive scientists. Indeed, the dialogue between cognitive science and Buddhist contemplative traditions has already begun, and the first results indicate that the evidence from meditative practices will be a valuable component of any future science of consciousness.
(12.3.7) Mind without biology. The schools of consciousness studied mentioned above all share the basic insight that consciousness is a cognitive process emerging from complex neural activity. However, there are other attempts, mostly by physicists and mathematicians, to explain consciousness as a property of matter at the level of quantum physics. Rather than viewing it as a phenomena associated with life, an outstanding example of that position is the approach by the mathematician and cosmologist Roger Penrose, 1994, who postulates that consciousness is a quantum phenomena and claims that we do not understand it because we do not know enough about the physical world. According to Penrose, Consciousness may arise from a deeper physical level within neurons, where certain small tube-like structures known as microtubules may display as yet mysterious quantum effects that may play a crucial role in the functioning of synapses. Consciousness, in the highly speculative view, is not an emergent property of living neural networks, but is produced by quantum effects in their innermost structures. Such views of mind without biology, in the apt phrase of the neuroscientist Gerald Edelman, 1992, also include the view of the brain as a complicated computer. Like many cognitive sciences, Edelman 92, Searle 1984, 95, Virali 1996, we believe that these are extreme views that are fundamentally flawed, and the conscious experience is an expression of life emerging from complex neural activity. Yet another approach posits a elementary form of consciousness, not as emerging from complex neural activity, but as a primary reality. Note that primary is used here in a different sense from the primary consciousness discussed in section 12.3.3. This view is widespread among spiritual traditions, many of which teach that the material world has emerged from such pure consciousness. We shall discuss the Buddhist conception of consciousness and is an example of this spiritual viewpoint in chapter 13. Recently, some cognitive philosophers have developed a variation of this view, according to which some pure experience or elementary consciousness may not be a secondary feature emerging from neural activity, but may be primary in the strongest sense of the word, the very basis of all observations. There is presently no scientific evidence for this hypothesis. However, since it has become a popular topic of discussion, we invited the quantum physicist and cognitive philosopher Michel Bitbol to explain in a guest essay, page 266.
And I believe that's where the reading ends.
Okay, cool. So maybe Diego, are you up for your triple braid of consciousness lesson? We asked Diego to help us think about that.
I mean, this is just going through it for my own sake as much as everybody's. Going back to this part here, can you see the cursor on the screen?
Yeah.
Where it says, to reach a full understanding of consciousness, we must approach it through the careful analysis of conscious experience, that's the first braid, of the physics, biochemistry, and biology of the nervous system, that's the second braid, and of the nonlinear dynamics of neural networks. So to me, I understood this as basically being, in order to understand what consciousness is, or to even be prepared to approach consciousness with the question of understanding it in mind, you need to be operating on these three levels of investigation. And the first one, they all kind of influence one another, but so you can basically start anywhere. But to start with one, the physics, the biochemistry, and the biology of the nervous system is basically the ingredients that you have inside the system. It's what the system is, what it comprises, what it is made out of, and it's the kind of the building blocks of what you have. So understanding that is important. And then the next level is understanding the behavior of those building blocks. And that's the nonlinear dynamics. Those kinds of biological systems are interacting with themselves in ways that are not that are a lot more complex than linear dynamics. So you have this kind of unpredictable or emergent sense of behavior and dynamics that comes out of those building blocks. And the last one is the actual subjective experience, because if we're trying to approach this and understand what consciousness is, then this is sort of what you end up with. Like if the first two are what produce subjective experience, then subjective experience is what you're left with as a result of those first two. It's what emerges out of those two. And so to even be able to put the behavior of the system and the system itself into context, you need to know what you're looking for and what you have as a result of the behavior of that system. And that's the subjective experience. Maybe if anyone has questions, that could be clarified any further, but that's how I understood it. There's a lot that goes into each one of the braids within the triple braid idea, but that's how I understood this reading to be presenting.
I have a couple questions, Diego.
Yes, please, Lauren.
First of all, thank you so much. That was wonderful to listen to. I probably understood one half of one braid of what you said, but I really enjoyed.
That's my
listening.
fault.
No, not at all your fault. It's your ability to be so captivating, even when I can't always follow. But I did want to ask you something about one of the earlier readings that we did in this series, where the idea of chirality, or like the idea of the spiral, was discussed in relationship to consciousness.
Mhm.
And I wondered if you could review and reconnect my memory of that, because this is all coming from one writer. I'm interested in these kind of graphic visualizations that he's giving us, like spirals and braids kind of have something in common. So I'm wondering if you had anything to say about the spiral and the braid and Capra's idea of chirality.
Yeah, I think chirality has to do with this because it deals with symmetry. Like if you place like the bird wings that were on the diagram last time, if you place those two next to each other, they're symmetrical. They're mirror images of one another. And I think, I don't know that the reading really speaks to this, but for what I get from it is that, and I mean speaks to it directly, but what I get from it is that consciousness is the reflective consciousness is an integration of the kind of like, it's like it integrates your sense data. It makes it so that you can reflect back upon it. And so encompassing all of the symmetry of a system is, to me, fundamental to being conscious of the system. I don't know if, I think that's kind of an elementary way to look at it, but that's as far as I can see the direct connection between those two things. But you know, one of the things that that I thought of at the end of this reading was this idea about phenomenology and introspection and direct study of subjective experience. The psychologist Carl Jung talks. I think his works are a good example of this kind of direct
on a pandemic. Oh, hold on. Where are you going?
Introspection. And what you find in that and a lot of other, like also in the religious traditions, is that the spiral and the symmetrical patterns and the unification of two opposites within an encompassing system is really fundamental to, like, you get that, you're presented with that, you become aware of that when you go deep enough into introspection or examination of consciousness and subjective experience. Like those seem to be fundamental patterns that are sort of ingrained in either what we're perceiving, which is the idea of like our consciousness being representing an independently existing world, or fundamental to our mechanism of perceiving and like bringing forward a world. So in both cases, those shapes, that kind of unification of opposites, the symmetry of opposites, and the whole that encompasses all those things seem to be fundamental.
Well, just to kind of throw my second question out, it has to do with optics. And I know a little bit about color theory, And I've seen some diagrams that show spirals about how the optical nerve receives color opposites like blue and red. So I've seen diagrams that suggest that the nerves move in opposite directions and form spiral coils between the eye and the brain. And I'm wondering at that edge of perception from the diagrams that were in our diptych that Goran had chosen about people and optical tools and systems like braids that include the kind of biological aspect of perception. I wondered if you could talk about like optics and color and the perception element biologically and how that might relate to consciousness.
I absolutely would. I'm going to be right back because I realized I accidentally locked my brother out of this room. So I'll be right back.
We'll hold
Thank
that thought for you.
Okay, I'm very sorry. He was knocking at the door and he didn't have his key.
It just, that was, you left us in perfect theatrical suspense.
Can you remind me of the last part of your question? And I know it has to be-
Let's just say let's just consider it like a great game of telephone, because nothing that I said actually made much sense at all. So let's
Okay.
just say whatever in that you remember and want to talk about
Great.
will be what my principal question was.
Great. It made sense. I think what I got from it was the first part, which this is the part that I don't know too much about, which is the nerves producing the spiral pattern when they are relaying opposite colors. I don't think I can speak too much to that, but what I can speak to is the differences in color perception, like the fact that the subjective experience is so closely like tied to the biological embodied structure of the structure of the eye, the structure of the brain, the whole system that integrates the sense data. And that's widely variable between like any organism that you find, and even between individuals of the same kind of organism. You're getting basically a system that is able to take what is out there and make it into something that, when perceived, allows the greater system that encompasses the perceptual system to better propagate itself or be able to maintain itself. And you can look at that in a kind of reductionist, like evolutionary biology. You know, is this evolutionarily advantageous? But when it comes to this question about consciousness and perception, what it means is that the idea that you're like here on the screen down here, the bringing forth of the world through the process of living is really what is going on. Like it really depends on you can't have each of that, like that the biology braid. If you change that, the other two are just as proportionally impacted by the change. That you don't get, you can't compare any of the sensory experiences from one to another when the biological components of the system that the perception emerges out of or is emergent from are different. I think that's what I have to say about it.
Thank you, Diego.
Yay, Diego. Thank you. Yeah, it's a tough one. I feel like it's like the biology braid might not be the most fundamental braid though. Like it's not like, I mean, one reflection I have is I feel like the sciences are trying to open up and embrace complexity dynamics, quantum physics and different aspects of understanding that some of our biochemistry history didn't incorporate into its paradigm yet. And so it's like, that's why I felt with this particular reading, it was like, we have to open up to other layers of understanding to really be able to describe how consciousness arises beyond just the chemical reactions and the neurons firing in our brain, you know? So,
Right.
but yeah, it's a toughie. That's why
Yeah,
call it the hard
I think
copy.
that like that's definitely true when it comes to assigning the like one of the braids as being responsible for dictating the behavior of the whole system, the whole braid, triple braid. But I do think that each of the braids is none of them is more fundamental than any of the others. They're all equally as responsible, because you can't single one out that's responsible for the whole behavior of the system.
Totally. It's that complex systems thing, interconnected exchange. Awesome. Thank you, Diego.
Do we want to move on to the second reading?
Yeah, let's get into the
Okay,
second
okay.
reading.
We starting with consciousness and language there? Okay. Consciousness and language. Umberto Maturana was one of the first scientists to link the biology of human consciousness to language in a systematic way. He did so by approaching language through a careful analysis of communication. Communication, according to Maturana, is not primarily a transmission of information, but rather a coordination of behavior between living organisms. Such mutual coordination of behavior is the key characteristic of communication for all living organisms, with or without nervous systems, and it becomes more and more subtle and elaborate with nervous systems of increasing complexity. Language arises when a level of abstraction is reached at which there is symbolic communication. This means that we use symbols, words, gestures, and other signs as effective tools for the mutual coordination of our actions. In this process, the symbols become associated with abstract mental images of objects. The ability to form such mental images turns out to be a crucial characteristic of reflective consciousness. Abstract mental images are the basis of concepts, values, goals, and strategies. Note that our use of mental images in the sense of abstract images created by reflective consciousness is different from Damasio's use of them as conscious experiences of neural patterns. Maturana emphasizes that the phenomenon of language does not occur in the brain, but in a continual flow of coordinations of behavior. As humans, we exist in language and we continually weave the linguistic web in which we are embedded. We coordinate our behavior in language, and together in language, we bring forth our world. The world everyone sees, write Maturana and Varela, is not the world, but a world which we bring forth with others. This human world centrally includes our inner world of abstract thought, concepts, beliefs, mental images, intentions, and self-awareness. In a human conversation, our concepts and ideas, emotions, and body movements become tightly linked in a complex choreography of behavioral coordination.
The nature of the self. Damasio's theory has contributed significantly to our understanding of reflexive consciousness. It enables us to form a concept of self that overcomes what Francisco Varela has called our Cartesian anxiety. We are self-aware, aware of our individual identity. And yet, when we look for an independent self within our world of experience, we cannot find any such entity. According to Damasio, there are two types of self associated with the two types of consciousness, which he calls the core self and the autobiographical self. The core self is a transient experience of self that is continually recreated as we interact with objects in our environment. The autobiographical self, associated with reflective consciousness, is a collection of mental images that appears to remain constant, although it evolves over a person's lifetime. Damasio emphasizes that the autobiographical self requires the presence of a core self to begin its gradual development. The contents of the autobiographical self can only be known when there is a fresh construction of core self. In a nutshell, the core self is a feeling, while the autobiographical self is an idea. Both are real, but neither is a separate entity or structure. Cognitive linguistics. The investigation of the connection between reflective consciousness and language, pioneered by Maturana, gave rise to the new scientific discipline of cognitive linguistics, which examines the nature of language from the perspective of cognitive science. In recent years, this new field has led to several significant advances in our understanding of the human mind. According to George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, these can be summarized in terms of three major discoveries. Thought is mostly unconscious. The mind is inherently embodied, and abstract concepts are largely metaphorical. The first discovery means that most of our thought operates at a level that is inaccessible to ordinary conscious awareness. This cognitive unconscious includes not only our automatic cognitive operations, but also our tacit knowledge and beliefs. Without our awareness, the cognitive unconscious shapes and structures all conscious thought. The embodied mind. The concept of the embodied mind was introduced by Francisco Varela in the early 1990s and was expanded considerably during the subsequent years. When cognitive scientists say that the mind is embodied, they mean far more than the obvious fact that we need a brain in order to think. Recent studies in cognitive linguistics indicate strongly that human reason does not transcend the body, as much of Western philosophy is held, but is shaped crucially by the detailed nature of our bodies and brains and by our bodily experience. The very structure of reason arises from our bodies and brains. This notion of the embodied mind is consistent with the hypothesis advanced by the primatologist Roger Fouts, 1997. That language was originally embodied in gesture and evolved from gesture together with human consciousness. According to Fouts, the early hominids communicated with their hands and developed a skill of precise hand movement, both for gestures and for making tools. Speech would have evolved later from the capacity for syntax, an ability to follow complex patterns, sequences in the making of tools, in gesturing and in forming words. The notion of the embodied mind is also consistent with Damasio's assertion that all conscious cognitive processes depend for their execution on representations of the organism. Their shared essence is the body. In other words, the mind is inherently embodied. The mind's embodiment can easily be illustrated by our use of spatial relations, which are among our most basic concepts. As Lakoff and Johnson explain, when we perceive a cat in front of a tree, this spatial relationship does not exist objectively in the world, but is a projection from our bodily experience. We have bodies with inherent fronts and backs, and we project this distinction onto other objects. Thus, our bodies define a set of fundamental spatial relations that we use not only in orienting ourselves, but in perceiving the relationship of one object to another. Some of our embodied concepts are also the basis of certain forms of reasoning, meaning that the way we think is also embodied. For example, when we distinguish between inside and outside, we tend to visualize this spatial relationship in terms of a container with an inside, a boundary, and an outside. This mental image, which is grounded in the experience of our body as a container, becomes the basis of certain form of reasoning, as Lakoff and Johnson persuasively illustrate. Suppose we put a cup inside a bowl and a cherry inside the cup. We would know immediately, just by looking at it, that the cherry being inside the cup is also inside the bowl. That inference corresponds to a well-known argument or syllogism in classical Aristotelian logic. In its most familiar form, it goes, all men are mortals. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The argument seems conclusive because, like our cherry, Socrates is within the container or category of men, and men are within the category or container of mortals. We project the mental image of containers onto abstract categories, and then use our bodily experience of a container to reason about these categories. In other words, the classical Aristotelian syllogism is not a form of disembodied reasoning, but grows out of our bodily experience. Lakoff and Johnson argue that this is true for many other forms of reasoning as well. The structures of our bodies and brains determine the concepts we can form and the reasoning we can engage in.
Metaphors. When we project the mental image of a container into the abstract concept of a category, we use it as a metaphor. This process of metaphorical projection turns out to be a crucial element in the formation of abstract thought. The discovery that most human thought is metaphorical has been another major advance in cognitive science. Metaphors make it possible to extend our basic embodied concepts into abstract theoretical domains. For example, when we say, I don't seem to be able to grasp this idea, or this is way over my head. We use our bodily experience of grasping an object to reason about understanding an idea. In the same way, we speak of a warm welcome or a big day, projecting sensory and bodily experiences into abstract domains. These are examples of primary metaphors, the basic elements of metaphorical thought. Lakoff and Johnson theorize that we acquire most of our primary metaphors automatically and unconsciously in our early childhood. For example, for infants, the experience of affection typically occurs together with that of warmth, of being held. Thus, associations between the two experiential domains are built up, and corresponding pathways across neural networks are established. Later in life, these associations continue as metaphors when we speak of a warm smile or a close friend. Our thought and language contain hundreds of primary metaphors, most of which we use without even being aware of them. And since they originate in basic bodily experiences, they tend to be the same in most languages around the world. In our abstract thought processes, we combine primary metaphors into more complex ones, enabling us to use rich imagery and subtle conceptual structures when we reflect on our experience. For example, to think of life as a journey allows us to use our rich knowledge of journeys while reflecting on how to lead a purposeful life.
Concluding remarks. Let us now summarize the recent advances in cognitive science discussed in this chapter. The main achievement, in our view, has been the gradual but consistent healing of the Cartesian split between mind and matter. In the 1970s, a few cognitive scientists recognized that mind and consciousness are not things, but cognitive processes. And they took the radical step of identifying these processes of cognition with the very process of life. Thus, cognition became associated with all levels of life. This means that mind and body are not separate entities, as Descartes believed, but are two complementary aspects of life, its process and its structure. The more recent research in cognitive science has confirmed and refined this view by showing how the process of cognition evolved into forms of increasing complexity, together with the evolution of corresponding biological structures. Consciousness, that is, conscious lived experience, unfolded at certain levels of cognitive complexity that require a brain and a higher nervous system. The biological roots of consciousness lie in the unconscious proto-self, a continually changing neural map of the organism, which is a characteristic feature of mammals and other higher vertebrates. Primary consciousness, or core consciousness, emerges with the emergence of mental images from these neural maps. Primary consciousness provides the organism with a transient sense of self, the core self, in the act of perception. The stream of consciousness arises from the steady generation of consciousness pulses that correspond to the endless processing of myriad objects, actual or recalled. In the history of evolution, gestures evolved into spoken language when the hominid brain developed motor regions that control precise hand movements and precise movements of the tongue. And together with language, reflective consciousness and conceptual thought evolved in the early humans as parts of ever more complex processes of communication. While primary consciousness is associated with transient experience of self that is endlessly repeated, reflective consciousness is associated with an extended sense of self. This larger sense of self arises when the transient images of the core self are enriched by memorized and seemingly invariant autobiographical images. At the level of reflective consciousness, the process of cognition is the continuous flow of mental images we experience as thought. Most of these images, and thus most of our thought processes, remain unconscious. This cognitive unconscious shapes and structures all conscious thought. All mental images, and therefore all thought processes, whether conscious or not, emerge from the neural maps of the proto-self. Thus, the human mind is inherently embodied. The very structure of reason arises from our bodies and brains. The use of metaphors is fundamental to human thought because it allows us to project bodily experience onto abstract concepts. Indeed, our abstract concepts are largely metaphorical. Many details of this science of mind and consciousness still remain to be clarified and integrated. However, we now have the outlines of a scientific theory that overcomes the Cartesian division of mind and matter that has haunted Western science and philosophy for more than 300 years. In this new science of cognition, mind and matter no longer appear to belong to two separate categories, but can be seen as representing two complementary aspects of the phenomenon of life, process and structure. At all levels of life, beginning with the simplest cell, mind and matter, process and structure are inseparably connected. For the first time, we have a scientific theory that unifies mind, matter, and life. Okay. Ooh-wee. So those were our two readings for tonight. I'm going to just restate the guiding questions to initiate the conversation. But very interested to hear any reflections you have in general beyond these questions as well. So the first question I had kind of built off of this second reading, and I got really intrigued by thinking about how metaphors shape our understanding of the world, and how there's certain metaphors embedded in our culture that lead to destructive actions unconsciously. Something I've thought a lot about with the Harrisons, some mentors of mine. So the first question is, how do you think metaphors shape our understanding and actions in the world? And how can we flip destructive or exploitative metaphors? And when I talk about flipping metaphors, I think about this a lot because with the Harrisons, I always use this example. They would say, you know, what if flood control was the spreading of waters, or, you know, the way our language structures the world and structures our thought, like, what is wastewater? Is there any real wastewater? Or, you know, so just being really aware of how words and metaphors can influence our behavior. And so curious if anyone else had some examples of that. And then the second one is related to this idea of consciousness studies beyond the human protagonist. So how can we think about consciousness studies beyond the human protagonist? What other forms of decentralized consciousness might exist? And how might we more deeply empathize and relate with the consciousness of other animals or even forests or other living systems? So those were my two seeds of thought for tonight.
I'd like to answer the second one if that's okay, or give some thoughts.
Excellent.
It's not a surprise to anybody that knows me that I would advocate that fungi are definitely an example of sort of non-human protagonists, examples of consciousness, and especially the decentralized aspect. My background here is there's two slides. One is of a neural network, and the other one is of a mycelial network. And yeah, I think like in terms of like if you're thinking about sensitivity, decision making, learning and memory, fungi, and mycelial networks, definitely in my mind incorporate some sense of consciousness. I mean, they're able to organize a wild amount of information. Every hyphal tip of a fungal network is constantly being dissolved and regrown, interpreting new information and sending that information backwards and upwards throughout the entire network. It has to make decisions in a lot of cases of like which ways to grow towards food or ways to like sort of self organize in an efficient manner. And even the concept of I think memory is really interesting with fungi as well. If you like remove like a block of like myceliated wood that was like growing onto a nice wood chip next to it, it will immediately, after you remove it and place it somewhere else, start to regrow in that direction again. So there's this idea of memory in there, but those are like really basic kind of to me. I think even more so if you look at the conscious networks within ecosystems and forests, they have a great sensitivity towards warning like different plants. If one plant is being attacked or being eaten by insects or some kind of predator, the mycelial network will sort of send a communique to the rest of the other trees in the area to let them know to start tasting really bad so that things don't eat them. Even this like concept of mother trees, feeding food and resources to trees that are stuck in the canopy and even stunting their growth so that they don't get overpopulated and disease doesn't fall. And even if the canopy opens up and a tree now gets hit with sunlight, a baby tree that is, the network now knows that you're getting food now, so we don't have to divert food to you. We can sort of channel it to other areas. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, sorry, that was like a big explosion. Obviously, I'm a huge nerd for fungi, but I definitely feel like fungi are a great example of non-human, non-animal even, examples of conscious networks. And that's, I feel like, just the tip of the iceberg. And I love that question a lot. I think that that was like a great sentiment from the mushroom at the end of the world, was non-human protagonists.
Yeah.
That was really great, James. This
Yeah.
always makes me think of the book that I'm sure I've mentioned before, which is called How Forests Think by Eduardo Kohn. It really goes into like what I think is a better definition and exploration of consciousness as a property of like systems that doesn't depend so strictly on this idea of like a reflective self or like these properties that are just unique to the particular human consciousness that there is and that we have. When you sort of look past that or let go of the attachment that's so focused on that, you can see a lot of the dynamics of ecosystems and signaling and networks of perceptual systems, aka organisms, and they are, I think, like good examples of what we were calling decentralized consciousness.
Totally. I know that book, Diego, and it talks a lot about like biosemiotics, which is like the signs and signals of communication beyond language. So actual physical signs and signals, pheromones, other ways of communication beyond oral language. And it's really an interesting area of study. I've been kind of geeking out on it in my PhD program a little bit because it's so fruitful in kind of recognizing this whole other level of interaction and communication. And even if the physical bodies of trees and other species, you can see how they're communicating. Even if you can't speak the same language, you can see it in like the way their bodies, their physical being even you can start to see how there's a level of communication going on that's really deep, you know? So yeah, and that book, How Forests Think, it's really intense, but really great. And like, they're really trying to give us a chance to decentralize human consciousness as primary. And I agree with like the reflective consciousness. And I think there's degrees of reflective consciousness in all sorts of species beyond human too, that we don't, you know, we can't like say, but like, yeah, so it's a good book on this topic for sure.
Yeah, I want to add to that, and I forgot to say that even with fungi kind of, but just things in general, like the idea like of incorporating like this like subjective self-experience and like being able to reflect. Obviously that's like a difficult thing with non-human things, but I think it's just really important to remember the sentiment that the fact that we lack the language skills to communicate with nature does not impugn the concept that nature is intelligent or conscious. It just speaks to our inadequacy of our skill sets for communication.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that like the reading singles out this human consciousness as and it calls it reflective consciousness, but it seems impossible to me, and I'm sure that there are others who hold this view, that there are not commensurate or comparable systems of consciousness that aren't configured the same way as human consciousness, that aren't reflective in the same way, that don't generate the same subjective experience as human consciousness, but are like processing the sense data in a way that is more than like an immediate constantly mired in the here and now way, which is not to speak badly of being mired in the here and now. I think that like that kind of what the reading called proto self is still just as viable, useful, accurate, and important a kind of consciousness as the reflective consciousness. And it's like an ingredient that is expanded on and incorporated and integrated into what must be an unimaginably complex number of other kinds of consciousness that we just don't have the consciousness to understand.
And I thought it was curious that you used the phrase mired in the here and now, because for me, when I was reading about that more elemental way of being, it struck me that a number of meditative practices I've been exposed to, that's exactly the goal, is to reach a less cognitive state, almost go backwards. Maybe there's a wisdom there in just being here and now, and it's not easy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think like it's funny to see that in the reading, that you know, they even without, it seems like without trying to, they still end up like sort of elevating the human consciousness as this like paradigm defining thing. Like they say higher vertebrates and higher mammals and stuff like that, and then they go and talk about the religious traditions when those religious traditions are saying like, you know, no, the autobiographies, the like cleaving of the world into past and present and future, and here am I separate from everything else. That's what clouds your view from what is, you know, the most integrated, the most accurate, the most embodied kind of consciousness, and the most like, in those traditions they call it divine. So, you know, and that's what the reading sort of speaks down upon without even trying to speak down upon it, as just being like a proto self or a primary consciousness that then, you know, was blown out of the water once great apes evolved.
Yeah.
And do you
Go ahead.
do you think that that choice of language on the part of the authors was a conscious one? Do you think that they are speaking to their scientific peers and trying to make a case for this in the commonly accepted language? Or do you think that is actually an example of being unable to get out of one's own viewpoint?
I think it's the latter. I think that like it's the same trope that is just present in so much of this like neuroscience and cognition research, and talking about like, I mean, you watch any like sort of simplistic documentary about animal intelligence, they're talking about how similar are these animals to humans, like how close can they get to acting like people or human people. And in doing that, they just like, it's so common and so like frequently reproduced a view that I think that it just got cycled into this piece here by the author. I could be wrong though, I don't know.
Well, I think it's a great question just because it relates also to the power of metaphor and language in like directing the way we form thoughts, because there's these certain languages that have been accepted in academic and professional circles that like those metaphors of the proto self and higher consciousness need to be retired, but like because they implicate this hierarchy that is actually unnecessary, really, and you know, because there's other forms of intelligence that are whatever, it's like more advanced, or like doesn't even need to be like a hierarchy all the time, you know. That's another thing metaphors that we use can do, is like reinforce hierarchy all the time, you know, or like black and white thinking, or you know, those kinds of things. So it just relates to that other side of the reading too, around language and metaphor.
Yeah, and that idea of linguistic concepts and a highly cognitive based thought process somehow yielding deeper truths than one that is embodied, when they within that section also argue that really we have no language of location without embodiment.
Totally. Yeah, the embodiment part was really interesting to me.
I mean, I think it's useful
go ahead,
to.
sorry.
I think it's useful to put these readings into a perspective of the history of thought, because, you know, it's a concept of realism versus anti-realism. Realism says, here I'm putting forward this theory that, you know, describes reality. And even if we can't observe it, we are going to describe reality using this theory. And the readings that we're doing now are changing that to say, here are a number of other theories that are useful to understand reality, but you can really, you know, going back even to the 17th century, people were quite clear, you can never really go through the exhaustive list of individual circumstances that validate the theory. So we're in an anti-realist situation where it's really all speculation. And I think we shouldn't be under the delusion that we've replaced a Cartesian world with this world, which is now, because a little bit more complex, that this is now reality. We don't know reality. We have a model of reality that is emergent because of the complexity. Emergent as opposed to reductionist, which means that you can know it by knowing little parts of it. And in totality, all this is just a more useful way of understanding the world, a more useful way of constructing reality. In that way, really what we can say and what's useful from these readings is that we really have to shift our paradigm of seeing the world and constructing the world. And so ultimately, you don't know if the fungi has a thought or if it's got a completely other way of navigating and decision-making. You can barely articulate the difference between higher consciousness and primitive consciousness in your own mind because you're trapped by language, which is embodied. So all of these factors, I think, lead to a way to understand this reading as just a better way to navigate the world, as opposed to a definitive understanding of that reality, of a new reality, or a creating of reality. But to something that Diego said earlier about creating the world through language or something like that, and it made me think of that the quantum physics parallel, which is that Einstein and Schrödinger were very adamant that there was a reality, and that Bohr and Heisenberg said, oh dear, we only create the reality because we measure it. So that's a sort of a parallel. And so I just think it's quite interesting that we really have wonderful language now with which to create a new paradigm. We have a new paradigm. And for some reason, it really hasn't taken hold in the world. And maybe here we're giving birth to it a little bit more, but by speaking about it, we sort of make it more real in a way.
I sure hope so, Ansu. I hope we are making it a little bit more. I know what you mean, because this isn't totally new thought, and yet some of the outdated metaphors and structures are just really holding on in certain like structural ways in our world, so it's taking a while for this to take hold. But I'm conscious of time because I'm I'm the timekeeper person too, and I know it's 7. Jen, should we just go ahead and talk about current events really briefly before we sign off to kind of connect all this to our real world context, and we'll do some sharing next time, or does that sound?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll share some of our works in progress next time, and because we had Diego pick out a few current events, because we're trying to connect all these kind of theoretical texts to some of our real world context that we're in this moment. So just taking a few moments to connect the dots here before we sign off.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kelly. These are some events that the people from the Learning and Mending team picked out. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen so that you can see them. Like last time, I'm not going to go scroll through, read the whole article, just for the sake of time. But this one, and maybe we can have somewhere where we can collect these links at the end so if people want to go through and read the articles themselves. I said I would do that last time on the chat, but I didn't get to it. So we'll have something that's more permanent than the Zoom chat. But anyway, this first one is kind of pretty relevant to what we were talking about. It's this study that was talking about how mitochondria are social, meaning that they have this like really complex system of signaling, and they can fuse with one another and exchange information, and then like separate back out into being individual mitochondria. Um, they, beyond just producing ATP, they are able to conduct a whole bunch of other processes within the cells. They regulate immune responses. They have to do, I think it said that they have to do with hormones, and they even stimulate or inhibit the development of certain kinds of structures in the cell. So in order to coordinate all this information, the authors of the study suggested that they have this kind of mechanism for electromagnetic signaling, that they're able to communicate information between the network of mitochondria within the cells, and that them being able to do that actually makes the organism as a whole better able to coordinate its responses and either fight off disease or coordinate the growth of its cells in a certain way, or a whole bunch of other cell processes because of this like social system of mitochondria in the cells. So that's the first one. And the next one is, the Zoom bar always blocks my tab at the front. The next one is sort of different. And this is talking about, this came out on Tuesday. And I chose this one because it's talking about this sort of really unprecedented move that that was just made to restrict water access to agricultural and industrial and commercial water rights holders, because of how severe the drought in California is. Some of these entities, like big farming companies or industrial corporations, haven't had their water rights restricted like this in either ever or several decades. In fact, some of them only went into business because of the perceived security of their water rights. And now that they're being met with these restrictions, their business models are becoming unsustainable. I chose this one in particular because one of the places that was that had water rights restricted to the agricultural rights holders, I put that in quotes because I hate actually saying rights holders, is the Scott River and the Scott River Valley. And right now I'm like sitting in a motel in the Scott River Valley, having done stream ecology and like forest ecology for the past few days with the Wildlands Conservancy on an internship that my brother actually got. I'm just tagging along. And they have been talking all the time about this thing that just came out. And the river is dwindling. I mean, it's a stream, it's a trickle. And then you drive and you see, just as far as you can see, fields of alfalfa and hay and cattle and big sprinklers going just blasting water all over the place. So it's tempting for me to say that, oh, this is great, people who have been wasting water are now not allowed to be wasting water anymore. But really, this is pretty dire, that like the situation is so bad that now like water restrictions are reaching into places that they have never reached before. And while that's great that the cattle industry doesn't get to waste water as much as they have, this is part of a continuing trend that's going to make water shortages worse for more than just the cattle industry and industrial water users. And that's because of climate change. It's because of increased fires, and it's because of something else that the article mentioned, but those are the two big ones. And now finally, the last one is this article about panpsychism that talks about the first mitochondria article. It summarizes what the first one said, but then it adds this second part, which the reading talked about very briefly, but it didn't call it panpsychism, which is this idea that consciousness is an inherent property of matter. That it's this idea that to get around the hard problem, some philosophers or scientists are proposing that what the like subjective experience is found in any kind of matter, and that is where it comes from to begin with. It's there to begin with, and then it just reconfigures itself into different collections of either the example that they gave in the reading or in this article was a chair or a table being a collection of atoms that are individually conscious, meaning that the way I understood it was that they have subjective experience, and to me that just means they respond to a perception of something. So you have the table, which is not conscious in and of itself, but each of the individual atoms within it are conscious, and then you have something like an organism that has unified consciousness throughout the whole thing. I chose this one because it was relevant to the first one, and it's an interesting perspective, and also it kind of ties into what is related to the phenomenology that's talked about in the reading, but also a pretty like rich area of study, which is like new materialism and object-oriented ontology, which develops these ideas, I think, better than this article is able to hit in a brief word count. But it's a really significant paradigm shift in thinking about the agency of what we would normally call inanimate objects or systems, and how consciousness is not is not cleaved off from the rest of the behavior of matter, and that it's really on a continuum with anything else that we would call the behavioral dynamics of a system, and that because of that, things that we would call objects actually have agency because of the way that they're configured and how they behave. So there you go. There's the current events. Hopefully that's interesting and relevant and makes you digest the reading a bit better.
Thank you.
Can I just take a moment to say, let's just acknowledge how Western science is like recapitulating things that many non-Western ancient societies have said for time immemorial. Panpsychism, mind blown.
Yes, I know. It's so true. It's very true, Ansu.
Definitely.
It's like you go so far down that path and then you realize you're wrong, and you want to hold on to the air of authority and certainty that the discipline held, and so you put a stamp on it, and you use the momentum that you had from being wrong the whole time to give yourself the authority to declare, okay, now this is it, because I have recognized that I was wrong. I was really wrong, but not because you were right all along.
Yes, it's such a good conversation. I'm loving this. Thank you, everybody. Next week, we're gonna build on ideas of embodiment and ask what health is, what true health is, which is kind of interesting. So please join, and that's a wrap. What a night. I have lots of things to think about and dream about. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Diego, especially, and James and everyone for your contributions.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
We'll see you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.